The Rubicon, starring Jeremy Winston, in 3, 2, 1.
This is Jeremy Winston with the Rubicon on Advent Sports Network. Thank you to all the listeners who have continually checked in with us week in, week out. I want to recommend that you go over and check out my boy, Lance James Lewis on the Lance J Radio Show to talk about what is sure to be an interesting week in sports as we prepare for the Super Bowl. But today we have on the show Dr. Tim Golden, who is professor of philosophy and the director of the Donald Blake Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Culture at Walla Walla University in College Place, Washington. That's a mouthful, but Tim is a great friend of mine from Philadelphia, and he is doing great things out there at College Place, Washington. Thanks for being on, Tim.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, really appreciate it. So listen, as I mentioned to the listeners, you are a doctor of philosophy and of course also professor of philosophy at Walla Walla. And I am very interested for you to give me and the listeners a sense of the professional field in philosophy. I know that this is a community, professional community, that a lot of my listeners and even myself am not too familiar with, and also to get a sense of the representation of minorities, specifically African Americans, in this community, and how one who may be listening, if they have any interest in going into philosophy, what some of the steps they may take. I know it's a multi-tiered question, but interested in all of those and your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me, and I'd be delighted to address this issue of philosophy generally, and then, of course, African Americans in philosophy. So I have my PhD in philosophy, and I am one of approximately 140 people in the United States who are African American who have PhDs in philosophy. Out of that 140, approximately 38 are African American women, and the remainder, of course, are African American men. And so we have a dearth of African Americans in philosophy. I think a principal reason for that is, as an academic discipline, philosophy has historically, in the Western tradition, been considered the godfather of all academic disciplines. It has been considered to be the ultimate arbiter of truth and rationality, and that's because philosophy at its core is the attempt to render a rational and comprehensive account of all that is. And if that sounds ambitious or ill-conceived, you might not be too far off with that. People. It is a very ambitious attempt.
All that is. I mean, I don't think that there becomes. There's nothing on top of that. Once your goal is to answer all that is, then there it is. That's the totality of it.
Right. That's correct. And so philosophy is conceived in this attempt to explain reality in the most general terms, and to do it at a level of generality and universality that is also rigorously logical. And we see this in the writings of ancient Greek philosophers in the Western tradition, like Plato and Aristotle. Now, this becomes a problem for African Americans, because from Plato to Aristotle and on through the present day, people of color, especially African Americans, have been considered sociologically and scientifically up through the better part of the 20th century to not be human. And so if one is not human, one is effectively outside the sphere of rationality as is defined by the canonical figures in the Western tradition. And we thus have a situation in which much philosophy has been done by white Western European thinkers in such a way as to justify the mistreatment and dehumanization of African Americans, because the anthropology or the account of human beings and what it means to be human has effectively excluded African Americans. So when you are considered to be outside the scope of rationality, it's difficult, to say the least, to be considered a philosopher, because rationality is precisely what drives the discipline. And so the weight and pull of history has been opposed to African Americans, considering them to be irrational and subhuman or non-human. And this is an uphill battle that African Americans have to fight against from within the discipline. So I have to spend much of my work justifying much of my academic work and my research justifying my existence as a rational being in a way that, for example, a white philosopher does not have to do, because whiteness brings with it a presumption of rationality and humanity that blackness, in the social sense, I use these terms, whiteness and blackness, not necessarily as reference to hardcore genetic scientific traits, but rather to the ways in which we socially discuss these terms in terms of our social and our political life. So when you have a person who phenotypically presents themselves as white, they are automatically invested with a degree of rationality such that they are philosophically credible in a way that myself, who identifies as African American and who is an African American, does not. So I have to. It's sort of like how Frederick Douglass has to prove that he's human.
Right.
He has to show that he's human first, and then once he shows that he's human, then he can get people to listen to him. But that's the real challenge. So I think the treatment of African Americans within Western civilization, and juxtaposed with the exaltation of rationality in the Western philosophical tradition, creates a situation in which African Americans have a hard time being included within the discipline. And this is a real problem within the discipline. And just to give you some sense of how profoundly exalted rationality is within the Western tradition, one should consider the etymology of the word theology. It comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. And if you study the etymology of the word theology and you juxtapose it to the etymology of thought and thinking and theory, which also has the Greek word theo. So in Aristotle, there's almost a direct association of rationality and thinking with divinity. In fact, in a particularly dense passage of Aristotle's Metaphysics, he describes God as a being whose thinking is a thinking on thinking. So this is, and this becomes this becomes
dense is a subtle way of describing that. But yeah, go ahead.
A subtle way of describing, and so this becomes a sort of idol of the Greek imagination, right? Because the God of Aristotle is not the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is a very different God that serves a different purpose. And Aristotle comes up with the view that not only are God and thinking pretty much one and the same, but interestingly, he holds the view that anyone who is born non-Greek is naturally a slave or a servant. Wow. And so in a very interesting way, we see a connection between what philosophers call metaphysics or ontology, the study of what's real and what is, with social and political life. Because now this metaphysical view is taken a step further, leads to a certain organization and arrangement of societies where people who fall outside of the Western white male paradigm are effectively defined not in an affirmative sense as Africans or Asians, but they are defined as non-Greek or non-white. And so that becomes a real problem. And I think the dearth of African-American philosophers bears a direct connection to a fundamental problem at the core of the discipline itself as conceived in ancient Greek philosophy.
So I think that that's one of the dumbest discussions that I've heard recently on Facebook and in the blog sphere on Twitter. Why are we as African Americans in 2016 waiting for Caucasian-based Hollywood to throw us crumbs? It's really that slave mentality. It's that house Negro mentality. I don't need, and Ice Cube kind of said it best. He said, he basically, to paraphrase what he said, they knew that the NWA movie was an excellent movie. It was a great biopic of NWA. It was one of the most successful movies of the year. They don't need the validation of Caucasian people to say that it's good for them to know that it's good. So I would implore my brethren and sisters listening, Grammys, Oscars, Tonys, all of that stuff, if they don't want to give African Americans the props that they deserve, let's not make them any more money. Let's just opt out, do our own thing. We don't need MASA to come in and say that you Negroes have tap danced and cooned around for us to our liking, so we're going to give you an award.
The Rubicon, starring Jeremy Winston, in 3, 2, 1. The Rubicon is an ASN Talk Radio expansion franchise about current events, news, and geopolitics. All footage is taped in Dayton, Ohio, and produced at Advent Sports Network's downtown studios in the lovely Emerald City of Seattle, Washington.
Wow, this is exceptional. I mean, most of what you said I was unaware of, but it makes so much sense, and it explains, I think, a little more. Just your speaking is a better, or probably the best definition of philosopher, because you've made those concepts very plain for me and all of our listeners. Again, you're listening. Absolutely. You're listening to the Rubicon with Jeremy Winston. We're talking to Tim Golden, who's professor of philosophy and director of the Donald Blake Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Culture at Walla Walla University in College Place, Washington. Just to continue on this one, because a question popped up in my mind. You know, and when we think of some of the great musicians, African American musicians, who have paved the way for a wealth of other success stories, one may think of William Grant Still, who's considered the godfather of orchestral music and orchestral arranging. Duke Ellington, of course, or even Louis Armstrong going before then. who would be considered a godfather, so to speak, or godmother? I don't know, for the African American philosophers. Who paved the way?
There are many. The first generation of African American philosophers I would say, began in the 1960s or early 1970s, and you had brilliant philosophers such as Joyce Mitchell Cook, who earned a PhD in philosophy at Yale University, spent a career writing on ethics and value theory. I was very fortunate to have had one of the giants and originators of African American philosophy on my dissertation committee at the University of Memphis. His name is Dr. Bill E. Lawson. He's still distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Memphis. There's also Charles Mills, who is endowed chair in ethics and moral philosophy at Northwestern University. Lucius Outlaw at Vanderbilt University. And in the more contemporary vein, I'm leaving out some names, so I can't name them all, but to name some more contemporary folks, there's Dr. Catherine Gines at Penn State University, who heads an organization called the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. So those 40 black women who have PhDs in philosophy, they are part of an organization that is spearheaded under her leadership, and she's just an incredibly gifted philosopher and scholar, and so she is a trailblazer in her own right. And then one of my real philosophical heroes, who I happen to know on a personal level, who is a mentor of mine, is Dr. George Yancey, who is professor of philosophy at Emory University, and whose landmark text, Black Bodies, White Gazes, hit the scene 8 years ago and provided a rigorous philosophical account of what it is like to exist in black skin from one day to the next. George Yancey is just an incredibly gifted philosopher. I'm very blessed to be able to not only call him a mentor, but to call him a friend. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I failed to mention Dr. Louis Ricardo Gordon, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, and whose groundbreaking work in a subfield of philosophy called Black existentialism essentially wrote the book on Africana philosophy, which includes not only African American thought, but also Afro-Caribbean thought. He's just an incredibly gifted philosopher who has almost single-handedly, along with George Yancey, written the book on Black existentialism. So these are real philosophical giants who hold their place, certainly not only in the African American pantheon of great philosophers and trailblazers, but I would argue within the broader discipline itself, they are philosophers of the highest caliber.
The Rubicon is an ASN Talk Radio expansion franchise about current events, news, and geopolitics. All footage is taped in Dayton, Ohio, and produced at Advent Sports Network's downtown studios in the lovely Emerald City of Seattle, Washington.